You are now tuned into the Victim's Advocate podcast with the Victim's Advocate himself, Brandon Stein. Let's get to it.
Welcome to the Victim's Advocate podcast, where we explore current events, crime, security, and insights into advocacy for victims of violent crime.
This morning, the highly anticipated criminal trial of Sean Diddy Combs is getting underway. The music mogul himself expected to be inside a Manhattan courtroom.
Welcome. I am here. You are there. My name is Brandon Stein, and you are tuned in to the Victim's Advocate podcast with, of course, Brandon Stein. This episode is brought to you by the people, and I'm happy to be here in sunny South Florida. And what we have going on is something that's been in the news. You can't, unless you're living under a rock, you've heard about P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, and everything that's going on with him. Now, he's finally, after 7 months in a jail over in Brooklyn, he's set for trial. This is a criminal trial. This is a federal trial. He was indicted 7 months ago on charges, indicted by a federal grand jury, charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, those are the criminal charges, and of course he's pled not guilty, meaning he's got to go to trial, he's going to have a jury, and if he's convicted, those charges carry potential for sentence of life in prison. Obviously some grave consequences for some serious allegations, serious crimes. Now, this trial is happening next week. It's not going to be recorded. It's not going to be videotaped. We're going to see paintings by courtroom artists that are going to come out and show Diddy in the courtroom, maybe show the judge, show their attorneys, and we're going to have reports on the arguments raised and the defenses made by Diddy. But I'll tell you, one thing that's been made clear, which is correct, is that this trial's got to be limited. It's limited in scope. Now, what does that mean? There are roughly 60 civil cases that have been alleged and filed against Diddy. And these 60 cases have to do with the freak-offs and the prostitution and the sexual assault, or all these allegations that certainly form the basis for the charges that Diddy was indicted on by a federal grand jury, but from a civil context, a civil standpoint, it's completely different. So there's the criminal case and you have the civil case. Now, Diddy can actually be acquitted of the criminal case, but he could be 100% liable for every single civil case, or he may settle every single civil case. We don't know. The greatest example of this is 30 years ago, OJ. OJ was, of course, on trial for the murder of his ex-wife and Ronald Goldman. He was acquitted famously. Johnny Cochran, if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. But that didn't stop a civil case from being filed against OJ, and that civil case went in the Goldman family's favor. Why? Because the burdens are different. What I always tell a jury is, I get up, I stand in front of a jury, I say, hey, look, a civil case is much different than a criminal case. So when we look to a civil case, what's very important is the burden, right? The burden is just that, just a tipping of the scale. But when we look to a criminal case, that burden, a lot more evidence has to be presented in order to convict someone, because it's dealing with their life, their liberty, their ability to be a free person, a free man in Diddy's case. So this trial that's happening in New York, which is a criminal trial, has no bearing on what happens in those civil cases. So Diddy can win the criminal trial but lose the civil cases. But the judge and the court basically confirmed that, hey, there is not going to be any commingling. This is going to be a trial that's limited to the criminal charges pending against Diddy. that the jury is going to be instructed for sure not to consider anything that's in the media. Now, one thing everyone always asks me is, when they hear that you go to trial or you try cases, is, well, what about the Google search? Why can't people just Google search and they find out information? Of course they're instructed not to, but in this case, it's going to be incredibly challenging for a jury to be selected that has never heard of this case, that has never heard of Diddy, that has never heard of Notorious B.I.G., that has never seen or Sean John, any type of apparel. Diddy's everywhere. So it's going to be virtually impossible for a jury to be selected without ever hearing of him. But in that context, it's going to be on the lawyers to make sure that jurors that are selected and that are picked, they need to uphold their duty. They take an oath as well, the oath of jurors, and they have obligations to comply with the rules that are set forth by the judge. And if they don't, they can be removed from the jury, and that's pretty significant. Now, Sean Combs or Diddy, as it relates to all these prior sexual assault allegations that were not included in the indictment, there was a video that came out from 2016 with his then girlfriend Ventura, where it was shown on video where he brutally just kicked her and assaulted her, and on this video, Diddy then gave an apology. But with this New York criminal trial, what the judge came out in saying is, hey, anything not included in the indictment, anything not included within those federal charges cannot be presented as evidence. So if the district attorney or the U.S. attorney who's prosecuting the case, if they didn't include any specific past incidents, and that these past incidents were not included in that indictment, they can't be presented as evidence. So even though there might be a plethora, a ton of other evidence against Diddy, it's not going to be included, it's not to be considered by the jury. So obviously that's a major victory for the defense. Now, I want to talk a little bit about these civil cases, because when we look to these civil cases, the question is, well, what's the recourse, and what's the basis for these cases? Now, a lot of these plaintiffs who have raised allegations against Diddy and sued him individually, I presume, and maybe others in his circle, were surrounding these freak-offs, and that there was this culture of physical and emotional abuse that they were involved in. And some of them were, such as I believe it was his then girlfriend, I think it was Cassie Ventura. She was signed to Bad Boy Records, and after it was described as an ostentatious, fast-paced, and drug-fueled lifestyle, and she was lured into a romantic relationship with Diddy. I mean, these are some really salacious and serious allegations, and a lot of other people have come out, and that's typically the way it works. But when it comes to the civil cases, because the burden is so much lower, it doesn't necessarily make it easier to prevail, but it makes it easier to establish liability or fault. But you still have to prove your case. You still have to establish that there was damage or harm that had occurred, because the remedy is money damages for these cases. That's what they're looking for. Whenever you hear settlement, or the settlement term is confidential, the remedy is always money damages. So when we look at all these allegations, and when we look at the video, that's all evidence against Diddy. Now, with these cases, and what I've seen in my career, whether it be cases involving trafficking, cases involving assault, violence, what have you, a lot of times what happens is the defendants, they obviously maintain their not innocence, but their lack of liability, that they did no wrong, but they enter into an agreement, they enter into a settlement. But one thing that's very, very important is whenever you have these types of cases, there's always security presence. And if it happens in a public area, there's video. And what's interesting is this 2016 video, there are cameras in the elevator area, but there are no cameras on the floor. So at some point in time, someone got this video, and it shows Diddy coming down the hallway and then kicking his girlfriend at the time. So, you know, from that end, there's not much Diddy can say. It's clearly him. Then it goes to the damages. So it's not just like a criminal case where you just want to prove that someone's guilty or prove that they're not guilty. It's proven that they're liable in a civil case such as this. But once you prove that they're liable, you need to establish that there was some sort of damage that you can compensate and quantify and put a dollar amount on. A lot of times when I get victims that come to me, they don't realize the difference between a criminal and a civil type of case where they commingle the same. Now there's a victim compensation fund, and that's provided by the state. That's through the criminal process in a sense. But what we do is it's much different because it's in the civil context, and you're going after either an individual, such as in these cases like Diddy, or you're going after an entity, a corporation, a company, a property owner. And that's where you get your compensation. That's where you recover your damages. So what's very, very important is when these situations occur, whether they're sexual assault, trafficking, regular assault, violent assault, rape, shootings, stabbings, whatever it is, one thing that we always look to is that there's security involved. You know, either there is security and it's lackluster, or there's just no security. So the way the standard works is a property owner has a responsibility to provide reasonable security measures for those on their property. And the key word there is reasonable. Now, is it reasonable to have a whole freaking platoon and the National Guard guarding a property to make sure that shootings don't happen or assaults don't happen? Probably not. But is it reasonable to have surveillance video cameras like we saw in that 2016 video of Diddy, where he abused and beat up his girlfriend at the time? That's reasonable. Have some surveillance video cameras. But that's what they call, a lot of times, it's passive security as opposed to active security. That's a passive security measure, meaning it's running, the video's running, but you can observe either crime or wrongdoing after the fact. Now, the way you could turn that into an active security presence is if you have an actual security officer or designated individual sitting in a control room where they have all the cameras and they're actively looking at the cameras, checking for suspicious or criminal behavior. Now, in this situation, Diddy was seen running down a hallway in his towel, and then he runs up to his girlfriend and kicks her and throws her down very violently and aggressively. Now, is that enough time if someone's actively watching surveillance video to come and try to intervene? Probably not. But if someone's watching it, they see that happening, they go up there immediately so that it doesn't escalate. Because I've also seen cases that I've had in hotel rooms where situations happen and then it escalates and then it escalates. So what's very, very important is when you look to these properties, I mean, there's no perfect way to do security. There's no perfect way to ensure that crime doesn't happen. And sometimes it's unpreventable. You know, a common defense that I see when I go up against these defense lawyers is their experts say, it's a terrible situation. We knew the area was known for crime. We knew there was a possibility or probability for crime. But hey, it was unpreventable. What can we do? So there are those situations, of course, where, hey, crime happens. What can you do? But when we look at the totality of the circumstances, when we look at everything, and if you're looking at a case where someone was brutally raped or shot or stabbed up, it's not just was there security there, it's what was the security doing. I've had many cases also where you have properties, hire security companies, and what are those security officers doing? They're on the phone, they're checking their Facebook, they're talking, they're in their car, they're sleeping. I've had cases where security guards have testified telling me that they're too scared, it's too dangerous for them to go down a particular street in a complex because it's known for gang violence or just a lot of crime. So the property owner does everything correctly. They hire a security company because they recognize that security is needed, but the problem is the security doesn't do their job. So it's not as clean cut, it's not as clear cut. Now these types of cases of course are different than what's alleged in those lawsuits that were filed against Diddy. That's a direct action against an individual for either committing or orchestrating either a sex ring, a drug ring, violence, whatever, the freak-offs. That's much different because you're directly alleging that this individual did X, Y, and Z. Whereas a lot of times where I deal with the victims of crime, the allegations are that a property or a company did not do something they should have done. It's usually that situation rather than they did something they should not have done. So there's a distinction, because the way I explain negligence to a jury is you get up and you say, hey, it's very simple, folks. If you want to look at negligence, we have jury instructions, the judge instructs you on the law, but it's, did they do something they should not have done? Did they do something that a reasonable person would not have done? Or did they do something did they not do something that they should have done? Did they not do something that a reasonable person would have done in the same or similar circumstances or same or similar situation? So the analysis when it comes to negligence and those types of cases, the civil cases where I'm an advocate for victims in that context is much different than a state attorney or a prosecutor, or in Diddy's case a U.S. attorney representing the people prosecuting crime or prosecuting alleged criminals who committed crimes. That's much different because they are in the pursuit of justice. They want to get justice, whereas in our system it's money damages, and that's the best it is, and that's what we explain. That's what I explain, whether it's to a jury or to friends or colleagues. Hey, look, the civil system is not perfect, but it's the best system we have because you can't put people in jail if they didn't necessarily commit a crime, or if it involves negligence or lack of security and they were negligently managing a property that led to a criminal act, that led to an injury or death or some other traumatic event to a person. But it's more so about the best system, the best remedy that we've come up with is money damages, to try to make someone whole. And it's hard. It's a hard work for a jury. In a sense, sitting on a criminal jury may be easier because it's either guilt or innocence. But when you sit on a civil jury, like maybe these Diddy trial cases, these lawsuits, they may not settle. The Diddy and his team or whoever's being sued may not offer enough. And in that situation, if they're not offering enough, you go to trial. But when you go to trial, it's not only about guilt or innocence. It's about liable or not liable, responsible or not responsible for whatever's been alleged and claimed as part of the lawsuit. So in many situations, you can technically be a plaintiff, meaning the person that brings the lawsuit, and win the case. You could prevail at the trial, but you really lose. What do I mean by that? You file a lawsuit, you go to trial, a jury comes back and finds the defendant liable, finds the defendant responsible, but they don't think there's any money damages. That's the problem. They don't think there's any money damages. So in that context, you are winning, you get a win, you proved your case from a legal standpoint, but when it comes to damages, you got little to nothing. So it's not just about yes or no on that verdict form. It could be yes, but then the number's too low and you don't get compensation for your injuries. So what was really, really important when I take on cases where there are victims of just horrific acts, whether it's rape, families of murder victims, shooting victims, stabbing victims, minors who are injured, minors who are at playgrounds and get shot because it's a bad neighborhood. You know, what I explain to the family is, hey, look, this process is never going to make you whole. It's going to attempt to make you whole. It's going to attempt to give you compensation for your loss, giving you reasonable and just compensation for the loss or for the injury. But it's not, you're never going to get justice. And I tell clients that all the time. You're in the wrong system. Criminal justice system, the criminal justice system. That's where you hopefully get justice and put the bad guys behind bars. That's the way it works. But on the civil side, whether it's direct actions against an individual like these Diddy cases, or it's indirect against a company, you're not going to get justice. A lot of times there's insurance at play, so it's not even like these companies are paying out of their own pockets. Insurance companies paying for the bad acts of their insureds. So I really caution clients in that regard. But, you know, circling back to this Diddy trial, it's going to be really, really interesting to see how it's portrayed in the media, because the media is going to be hearing the recounts secondhand. No one's in the courtroom live. In federal courtrooms, you've never seen a video. You know, it doesn't show up live. The OJ trial was a state trial. You know, that was a state criminal action. If he got convicted, he would go to a state penitentiary, a state prison. So you allow cameras in there. That's why that was such a Hollywood type of trial, or some of these other trials. You know, the Johnny Depp trial, Amber Heard. That's a civil trial, but that was, I believe, in Virginia, state court. You know, but when you're dealing with federal court, it's paintings and reporters who are sitting in there taking notes and recounting what they heard. So it'll be interesting to see how it's portrayed and how it plays out. But obviously Diddy, high-profile figure, probably hoping that his name and notoriety gets him off, like many of the other famous or infamous celebrities that have stand trial in the past and gotten acquitted on charges. This one may be different, but the evidence seems to be pretty difficult, so it should be interesting. Talk to you later.
That's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on the Victims Advocate podcast with Brandon Stein, and we'll see you on the next one. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Victim Advocate, on YouTube at The Victims Advocate, and visit our website at victimadvocate.com.